I'd like to extend a special welcome today to design students and faculty, historians, and the communities of the Institute for African American Studies, Digital Humanities, and Athens. Today's presentation promises to offer extra relevance as we consider the past, present, and future of the current state of Georgia and the special role that creativity plays in how we discover and share knowledge. Our guest is Willson Center for Humanities and Arts Distinguished Lecturer, Silas Munro. Silas brings his experiences as a designer, teacher, and author to us, and for that we are grateful. The mission of his Polymode design studio is to inspire people to elevate themselves and improve society. He earned degrees from CalArts and from Rhode Island School of Design. He's a professor at the Otis College of Art and Design and inspires many people through his work visiting schools and communities, facilitating workshops, and writing. He's featured recently in Magazine and the New Yorker Talk of the Town, and an Elephant Magazine article called The Age of Black Fabulosity, the Queer Publications of the Harlem Renaissance. And you'll find links to those articles on our website, ice.uga.edu. Silas, I want to say I appreciate you so much, and I feel really impacted by your work, and having met you briefly before, on everything that you bring to your scholarship and the way that you connect with people and inspire us to learn more about the past and think about the paths and people that we influence. It's so wonderful. And I know that we had planned to have you come here and to meet students and faculty and community members. And so let's think of today as an introduction to Athens and this wonderful group of people. And when it's safe to travel and safe to gather again, we'll do some workshops, we'll do some networking and learn more about your work and how we can work together. Thanks again for joining, and please welcome Silas Munro.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a really beautiful introduction, and I'm just really honored to be here. Yes, I would love to be in Georgia right now in person, but I think this is a great start. It's interesting because I really have had Georgia on my mind and heart lately, particularly considering the events of this last week. And I just wanted to dedicate this version of the talk to Black women in Georgia and their efforts to allow our votes and the votes of Georgians to matter and count. I think it's pretty auspicious that I get to talk about this work that Du Bois and his students, both women and men of color, that have a lot to do with Georgia and Atlanta in particular, where Du Bois lived and worked for many years. So I think giving this talk like after the last 6 months as well has another layer, considering the recent revolutions around Black Lives Matter movements that were sparked by George Floyd's murder this summer. And so I've just been a lot of feels and have a lot of emotions right now. And so I just want to give you, myself and you all, permission to be in this feeling space. And for me, design is an emotional act. I think that there is a sensory quality to design that is all about feeling. And in addition to those that I've dedicated this talk to, I also want to make a land acknowledgement. So I'm coming to you from Inglewood, California, but that originally is the unceded lands of the Chumash, Tonga, and Kitsch people. And the research that I'm going to share, I just want to say, in addition to being close to my heart, because it's about art and design, which I love, and it's close to my heart because it's about identity and humanity, that transcends race, color, creed, gender, sexuality, and nationality. It's about design, or using design to create a kind of utopia, or at least the hope for utopia. And part of that utopian aspect of this research is that it's collaborative. And so, as Mark mentioned in the introduction, it is the product of my contribution to a book called W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits Visualizing Black America. And that was edited by Whitney Battle Baptiste and Britt Russert, who are scholars of Du Bois at UMass Amherst, where his papers are stored. And it's, if you get a chance to get it, there are also a couple of really amazing essays by Mabel O. Willson, who is an amazing architectural critic and historian and practicing architect, and Alden Morris, who's the foremost living Du Bois scholar. So because there is sort of so much about this body of work, I have divided the talk into courses. And this is partly like a bit of my gallows humor, because working on the research of this was sort of facing a lot of darkness in America, but also this kind of amazing journey of this Black man going to Paris, and having this amazing exposure of his design collaboration. And so, like a sort of fine French meal, I'm going to present and start with an amuse-bouche called the Color Line. The appetizer is the Negro exhibit. An entree is two parts. So it is a study called the Georgia Negro, and also a second study called a series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves now in residence in the United States of America. And I'll just shorten that, referring to it as a series of statistical charts. And just there's some terms that you'll start seeing here, you know, that come from the time that Du Bois was living and working that maybe don't like align with the way we talk about people of color, Black people. So I just wanted to give a little trigger warning for that. After we have the entree, there's going to be this dessert where I talk about the implications of discovering Du Bois, and how that relates to my own art and design history, and potentially how we could reframe or are reframing design history going forward. And then there'll be a digestif, looking at some contemporary examples of how Du Bois's work affects now, and then close with a quote by James Baldwin. Widely known to be a prolific author, renowned sociologist, fierce civil rights advocate, co-founder of the NAACP, and historian of Black lives, Du Bois was also a pioneer of data visualization. And this quote from Du Bois, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," is one of his most famous and most widely disseminated quotes, which was published in his seminal Souls of Black Folks, or Souls of Black Folk, in 1903. And it's powerful for me because it's a quote that cuts through the intersection of race and class. But he also first mentioned this quote in a lecture in 1900, which is an important date because that's actually the year that Du Bois would explore this notion of the color line in a literal and metaphoric combination of ways, with the contribution of approximately 60 data visualizations or infographics to an exhibit at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, dedicated to the progress made by African Americans since emancipation. This was also called in French the Exposition des Nègres d'Amérique, or American Negro. And these data visualizations that he made with his students at Atlanta University were made in ink, gouache, watercolor, graphite, and sprinkling of photographic prints. And his students would use this visual language to create this crisp, dynamic, and modern graphics that argue as a form of infographic activism. And these diagrams actually sit inside of this exhibition, whose name that I mentioned. And the exhibition was actually something that was not just created by Du Bois, but it was actually organized by a man named Thomas Julius Callaway. He was a lawyer, educator, Fisk University graduate, and he was also the editor of the Colored American newspaper in Washington, D.C. And TJ, as he was called by his friends, also enlisted Booker T. Washington. And it's interesting because at this time of collaboration, this is sort of before Booker T. and Du Bois have this intellectual and public split, where they're sort of these kind of intellectual frenemies. But they still, while working together, kind of had this, differing perspective and brought different things to the exhibit, which basically was a representation, through the U.S. government to sort of show the industrial and imperial prowess of the nation at this World's Fair in Paris, but also through this exhibit, a commitment to social reform and having a focus on African American life. And in the exhibition, there are contributions by students and faculty from the Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, the Hampton Institute, and other Black colleges and industrial schools. And through a very rapid timeline, these creators and their collaborators created this amazing installation. And just to back up, Du Bois actually is the one of the team to go to Paris in 1900 to represent the exhibit. And a little bit about Du Bois is that he, is stylish and styling with this baller headgear, but just to sort of give you some context about him and the differences between Booker T, he was born in 1868. That's 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation began to free slaves in America. And he talks about himself in his own diaries or autobiography, where he describes himself in general thought and conduct. I became quite thoroughly New England. He was raised by a single mother and his grandmother. I'm just going to show the color line quote just so you could see that. And then these were the thumbnail. When I was talking about the posters, this is what you would have been seeing. And then just portraits of Du Bois, T.J. Callaway, and Booker T. Washington. Yay! Okay. So here's that top hat that was quintessential Du Bois. And it's interesting that seeing him in 1900 in Paris, going back to his education, so he had that first undergraduate from Fisk in Tennessee. That's how he was connected to Callaway. Then he also went to Harvard for his second bachelor's and a PhD in sociology, and he was the first Black man to do this. Even after the PhD, he had a fellowship to study abroad in Berlin, so he would have been familiar with Europe. That's also on the same trip that Du Bois ends up meeting with the Pan-African Congress in London. And so to basically get this commission for this exhibit in information design happened in late 1899. And the exhibition began on April 15th, 1900, and it would take at least 6 weeks by ship for the diagrams to make it to the exhibit. So Du Bois had this very compressed timeline. So after this debriefing with Callaway and Booker T. Washington in DC, he returned to his teaching post at Atlanta University, and he created the charts with the enlistment of the women and men of color that he taught. And in a sense, you could think of the infographics being the product of multiple forms of collaboration and co-creation. And across the diagrams, there are many references to Atlanta University, and the lead infographic of the second series images explicitly states that it was prepared and executed by Negro students under the direction of Atlanta University. And an Atlanta University alumnus, William Andrew Rogers, who had recently received his bachelor's degree in sociology, was the point person responsible for making and coordinating the design and production of the actual graphics. Few records remain about the working methods of Rogers, who may have been living in Petersburg, Virginia when he worked on the project, but based on the volume of the designs, each piece's complexity and detail, and only a few months to prepare for their portion of the American Negro exhibit, it seems implausible that Rogers and Du Bois worked alone to complete the project. Rogers and Du Bois no doubt facilitated renderings and typesetting from additional unnamed Atlanta University students and alumni who were also the ones who were assisting with the collection of field data. And there's a passage in Britt and Whitney's introductory essay that I'm going to read from. And while I read that, you'll see an image of students at Atlanta University during 1899 and 1900. The collaborative nature of the work that went into the construction of the images, as well as their public exhibition, illuminate Du Bois's investment in a truly public sociology. Bois also turned to Atlanta alumni to construct a robust network of field researchers across the South. Black women were among the field researchers who contributed their expertise and labor to the Atlanta studies. We might further speculate on how white working class patrons touring the American Negro exhibit in Paris interpreted and made meaning of this data on their own terms. Here, both viewers of the infographics and Black study participants in the US South came into view as legitimate co-producers of sociological knowledge. So I love this idea of both the making of the diagrams in the exhibit and also the reception and view have this kind of co-creation between designers, sociologists, and audience. This is an image of Du Bois's exhibitor card from the exposition. And, you know, part of one, I think, another sort of heartbreaking tragedy is that it was easier for the graphic design and exhibition design that Du Bois created to get to Paris than it was for him as a Black man. And so he actually wrote in his autobiography this: the details of finishing these 50 or more charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult with little money, limited time, and not too much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, nor was there a cabin left for sale, but the exhibit would fail unless I was there. So at the last moment, I bought passage in the steerage and went over and installed the work. And so this idea or image of Du Bois is this public intellectual, but like traveling in this kind of reverse middle passage does not sit comfortably with this idea of Du Bois also being part of the cultural elite and being this famous intellectual. And it also kind of is in conflict with this idea of racial progress and modernity represented in the infographics themselves. And so when he arrived at Paris, this is kind of this tipping point in the arc of modernity in Europe and America. It's sort of the end of the fin de silice. He would be strolling among the streets in the backdrop of the newly constructed Eiffel Tower. And in this moment of transitioning out of this sort of Victorian cynicism, pessimism, and ennui. And similarly, the pavilion, the architecture of the building that his exhibit would be in, was strategically positioned and designed in this Beaux Arts neoclassical architectural style as a kind of symbolic gesture of power from the United States. And the pavilion was also positioned adjacent to some of the other powerhouses like, France and Germany and the UK. And that sort of had tension between this rather inauspicious positioning of the exhibit in this palace of social economy. If you look at this floor plan, the Negro exhibit is in this corner, and that exhibit was adjacent to things like displays from the Prudential Life Insurance Company, or uh, kind of other sort of more diorama um, type installations that were kind of typical of exhibits at the time. And Du Bois, thinking about this, decided to garner attention from this unenviable location, that the exhibit would need to radiate its own sparkle and originality. It would require an imaginative resonance, causing visitors to pause and marvel at the mysteries conveyed by the displays arranged in the corner. And this is no small task given the mission of the exhibit. Um, Over the course of the fair, there were 30 million visitors. So that could be, thousands of thousands of people over the various months that the exhibit was on display. And it's interesting that the exhibition actually ends up winning a number of prizes for its innovative design. And I think part of that has to do with the haptic interactive way that it was conceived of. And so instead of relying on this like diorama or tabletop model presentations that was often used at the World's Fair at this time, Du Bois and his team used the information design as a rhetorical device. And so there's photo documentation that shows that at least half of the diagrams were mounted on these winged frames that were set on movable standards that would allow fair goers to actually flip through these large double-sided plates to see the rich data at eye level. And so those information diagrams were also positioned with all of the contributions by those historically Black colleges, as well as other industrial schools. And so there was an eclectic set of objects, images, and texts that include framed photographic portraits of prominent African American leaders and politicians, tools, harnesses, and other agricultural products. There's also even a bronze statuette of Frederick Douglass on site in the lower left corner, and a collection of over 250 publications authored by African Americans, including one of the photo frames being carved by a former slave. And having Douglass in the space also significant for Du Bois, who took that notion of the color line, was actually a phrase first written and spoken by Frederick Douglass in one of his speeches, but then Du Bois kind of grafts it on to the 20th century in such a poignant and prescient way. This is an image of the gold prize that Du Bois ends up winning. And because the exhibit is so successful in Europe, there's actually a group of African American club women in the States who actually end up taking the exhibit on tour through various places in the US, including the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. And so here's the souvenir of that reconfigured version of the exhibition. So there's this impact abroad, but also back in the States, and you can see Du Bois and Callaway in the exhibition. And you can see that Callaway is actually holding a copy of the Colored American sitting in that chair. And it's interesting that even after the exhibit came down in the United States, Du Bois continued to be interested in thinking about the exhibition, because he actually writes to the Library of Congress where the graphics end up, because he has further plans, but I guess never hears back from him. That's about in 1908, 1909 that he writes back to them. And so now that you have a sense of the context of how these diagrams were presented in space, I want to zoom into the character and quality of the diagrams. And to set that up, I want to show you the first two basically cover designs for each of the sets. The one on the left dealing with data that came from first-person sociological research that Du Bois and his students did, but also state census data and other forms of documentation that he would synthesize to form that report. And then the other set of plates speaks to national data and uses US census data and other kinds of forms. And I just want to pause for a second and let actually Du Bois speak for himself. So I have a recording that I'm going to play that's a short clip that is a autobiographical or biographical interview that Du Bois does with Moses Ashe in the 60s. So he's reflecting back on his time at Atlanta University.
In 1897, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough, that even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
So this this statement of Du Bois in sort of experiencing firsthand, not only systemic slavery, but the sort of repercussions of the discrimination and brutality that come out of that, become this driving force to create this visual expression of ways to talk about and show the equality of people of color. And so to dive a bit deeper into this first plate, part of what is so powerful about this study is that Du Bois's own dissertation was about the transatlantic slave system, and his first chart does this powerful gesture of visualizing and showing the complexity and the interrelated countries and states that are connected to this disenfranchisement. And this kind of striking map really captures the sweeping nature of the study. And Du Bois ends up using these fine lines and color coding that show and trace from the slave trade through the Middle Passage to emancipation and beyond, using this kind of unique form, visual form, to make arguments for equality and sophistications of Black Americans living under Jim Crow and this shadow of enslavement. And as you scroll down and look closer, there is also that seminal quote that is pasted as a kind of proclamation at the bottom, as well as this listing of an inventory of charts, maps, and I love this term, other devices that are designed to illustrate this development of the American Negro. And so they use Georgia as one case study, and then have this other set of diagrams that's looking at the national context of people of colors. And that's where you can see this direct reference to Atlanta University and the students that are working on this. I think part of the power also is you're seeing this rich palette of gouache and bright colors that also has this pretty unusual, inventive typographic language. It sort of looks like a sans serif typeface, but if you zoom in closer, it shows that the predominant letter style used in the charts has no curves, only straight lines, and it's more akin to lettering generated by templates designed for architectural or engineering plans. And based on the author's training in sociology rather than graphic design, it would make sense that the Atlanta University students use some templates and pre-existing tools. And this residue of the technical lettering that probably came from an American architectural lettering template is especially visible in the lighter weights, where you see that they've hacked and had to draw in diacritic marks for the French translation. So these accents have this kind of non-standard weight or heavier structure. And you actually see throughout the set a number of customized numbers and also this percentage sign, which is really striking. And so for me, seeing these diagrams that were made in 1900, which is more than a decade before the rise of dominant European avant-garde movements, the works predate modular design elements that often are considered to have their origin in Russian constructivism, to style, and Italian futurism, that have this not only rational and technically sophisticated construction, but also this emotional resonance. So in this diagram of slaves and free Negroes, you see this very composed, controlled red shape, and then this tattered field of black, which to me has symbolic representation for this pain and brutality of enslavement. At the same time, Du Bois and his team are also using geometric abstraction, so shapes that are built from circles or triangles and rectangles and bright primary colors or black and white. And this kind of progressive visual language is tied with very mundane and everyday data, showing and humanizing the Black teacher in this case in Georgia public schools. And when I look at this kind of visual work, I'm thinking about some of the things that I mentioned. This is 19 years before the Bauhaus, right? We can sort of think of Herbert Bayer, who is one of the students of the Bauhaus, who becomes a teacher and master of typography and printing. And it just blows me away thinking about that potentially one of the Bauhaus masters, Kandinsky, who was 19 at the time of the exhibition opening, could have seen these plates. So as I move forward with the talk, the implications of what this previously erased or hidden history of graphic progress starts to say about the way we have been speaking about or looking at art and design history. I am really drawn to this diagram that is talking about taxable property owned by Black Georgians. And again, speaking of Kandinsky, like this looks like one of the color tests that he would administer to his students at the Bauhaus, where he asked them to color in these geometric shapes, whether they were a circle, square, or triangle that he associated with specific color. And you can see, highly sophisticated composition and texture being used by these sociologists to make this rhetorical argument that definitely would have been influenced not by the Bauhaus, because that didn't happen, but by other things that Du Bois had been encountering in his own sociological training, but also his own projects. So I think of the Scottish statistician William Playfair, who is the one who creates the pie chart, creates bar charts and area charts, would have been something that Du Bois would have been referencing. And then also in the space of using information design to create a form of social change, there is this precursor of this 1859 diagram that Florence Nightingale ends up designing, who was a nurse actually in the British Army, and she uses this rose diagram to persuade the British government to invest more in hospitals and healthcare for particularly infectious diseases, which were causing a lot of injury in addition to what was happening in battle. And here's another diagram where Du Bois and his team are referencing this value of land owned by Georgia Negroes. And just looking at this, you just see all these foreshadowing of critical developments in the history of data visualization. And one of those is the simplified pictographic forms that you would see in the isotype picture language, which is a kind of the basis of any kind of web icon, right? Or sort of abstraction of objects that you see in information design. Here's a picture of one of the isotype diagrams that was designed by Otto Neurath and Marie Neurath, but this doesn't come until the mid to late 30s in Vienna. And it's clear that also kind of the way isotype has this kind of baggage of colonialism too with it, and you can see that you already have this designer of color kind of interrogating or questioning even things like colorism within the Black community. So visualizing and exploring that both in terms of a bar chart in the Georgia study, but also for the national study, they're taking the same kinds of data, but exploring it and investigating it in this area chart, which is evidence of them iterating and pivoting in a very intense project timeline, but also exploring different ways of like, how do you communicate or talk about these social dynamic issues in the form of graphic design. And there's such a rich variety to these charts. They're all digitized and you can see them on the Library of Congress website, but I see some of these and I think of the abstract painting of abstract expressionism and color field painting that we end up seeing later in the 20th century. And you can also see that there becomes this like typographic eclecticism where as the project goes on, you have a lot of different hands working in concert in different locations to get to this deadline. But then it also creates these really amazing, innovative new chart forms. This is what I've been calling the Du Boisian spiral, where they're linking both a bar chart and a pie chart together to create this really dynamic representation of very everyday items, household kitchen furniture, which again, kind of looking to graphic design, you see this is a poster from Josef Müller-Brockmann, which happens 60 years later. But this idea of graphic abstraction and data turned into form is just so prescient and really beautiful. Here's a heat map diagram where he's breaking down the population of counties in Georgia based on density using color. Here's another diagram with city and rural population that again is sort of fusing this linear representation of data into this kind of spiraled up coil. And the charts are full of these kinds of innovative ways of showing data, which to me I feel like comes out of a combination of intention and then also finding ways to represent the data within the limited space of these 20 by 21 inch broadsheets. This is one for literacy, where the charts are kind of weaving like a kind of form of lattice work. And then the last diagram I want to show you is this income and expenditure chart, which feels very highly sophisticated. And although Du Bois and his team were hardly the first to visualize data with this level of rigor in the pre-computation era, I believe these designs are unique and important. And this rhetorical innovation in the social sciences, coupled with a visual aesthetic very much at home in the 21st century, makes for a prescient body of design work. Here's one last detail where you can see that there is instructions to the fairgoers to actually lift the frame to interact with more data. And so seeing all this work really makes me think of sort of how does that affect us now who are contemplating and reconsidering design history and the future of what design can be. And that gets me to this audit or edit of my own design history, which was quite robust through a lineage of really thoughtful historians like Doug Silverfox Scott, who I had at RISD, and Lorraine Fierce-Wild. And I began thinking about who were their teachers of history and who influenced them. Like in graphic design, we have Philip Meigs, who wrote the first book of design history. And because Doug and Lorraine were educated both at Yale, they would have had teachers like Paul Rand or Bradbury Thompson or other European emigres, and were also influenced by the first design history course by Lou Danziger that was taught at CalArts and Art Center. But I'm saying, where am I in this history? Even Kathy McCoy, who was another teacher of Lorraine Wild at Cranbrook, who kind of brought a different perspective, there's really this dearth of people of color in particular that represent design history and tend to give this kind of flattened model of design history, which is this idea of the modernist celebrity clothesline, where you have a very kind of limited representation of what is design and comes very much to this European Western colonial viewpoint, and often is kind of a memorization of the best of and mostly of cis white men. And so for me, now that I've come to discover Du Bois and I'm also looking at other forms of design inspiration, you can create your own sort of chosen family. So perhaps design history happens more through influence, like Walter Gropius and Herbert Bayer, or contemporaries like Joseph Mueller Brockman and Max Bill, or Carl Gersten and Armin Hoffman, but you can kind of create this like graphic design string theory where you choose, I get to choose Du Bois being part of my lineage, or I can choose Sylvia Harris, or any other new cosmologies of design history. And that then sort of has implications for reconfiguring a whole syllabi. So once you bring Du Bois in, it reconfigures things like De Stijl or isotype or the Bauhaus, and then that could be applied to a whole set of figures. So what happens when you reconsider 1930s streamlining in the auto industry when you think about the Victor Hugo Green motorist book that people of color needed to sort of reframe and navigate this supposed auto utopia that brings in things like redlining and overpasses going through neighborhoods, particularly in Black communities, or even the notion of the Eames aluminum group, which came out in 1968, is the same year as the Memphis sanitation workers strike. So you get to sort of reconfigure and redefine a whole new sense of what could be design history. And because of the technical difficulty, I'm going to show this digestive, but kind of go through a couple of them more quickly. I just did want to talk about the typeface that I've been using here. Highly recommend Trey Seals, who is a type designer of vocal type, who's digitizing and looking at diverse voices through history and putting them into typographic form, where he has created a digital version of that stencil typeface that Du Bois and his students were using called William. And I think that this historical analysis of the way Du Bois was looking at urban framework was something that I recreated with students in 2019 in Philadelphia at University of the Arts there, who we worked on a 5-day workshop where we took Du Bois's data visualization, and then the students turned their eye onto Philadelphia, which is the fourth most segregated city in the United States, and each student looked at different ways in which data visualization or graphic design could reframe or show histories or contemporary life of Philadelphia in new ways. And then lastly, I really appreciate the paintings of Theaster Gates, who takes Du Bois's graphics and then abstracts them, moving the text and printing them, silk screening them on aluminum into these kind of forms of those kind of abstract expressionism that I mentioned, that the diagrams look like, and converting them into this kind of space of data abstraction as something you almost can like walk into, including turning some of the pieces into neons, which I think kind of take these graphics as indexical signs and turn them into a kind of like reflective meditation on Black progress. And so that I'll close with this quote from James Baldwin, who is someone that I come back to with this notion of history. And one of my favorite quotes is his, "On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." Thank you so much. The first one that came in is from Jill Severin. Do you know about the musical performance play in development at Buffalo by Amagarti Tagokuten and collaborators? It looks at the experience of African Americans seeing representations of African Americans at the Pan American Expo, ranging for racist white visions of slavery and the deepest, Darkest Africa, but also a version of the Du Bois exhibition. That's so cool. I did not know about this. Jill, I don't know, do you want to unmute and say a little bit more?
Um, it's so Ama Garte Tegukutin is most recently actually a professor here at UGA and has recently left, but she is an amazing um, device theater and performance person, and she and her collaborators have taken and I'll just say now that, as you can see from my question, I'm the worst typist in the world.
No worries.
She's taken essentially. At first, I was like, I wonder if it's the same thing, because I've come at this first by sort of looking at her musical and some of the stuff that's associated with it, but I'm pretty sure that it is, and it's this fascinating performance piece that is, I hope, destined for Broadway, that is looking at, I guess one of the things that she says is that that expo in Buffalo is the first time that African Americans can come to one of these expositions as attendees, instead of being on display in some ways.
Right.
And so it's that fascinating moment or interesting moment where sort of representations of themselves, they get to see those representations of themselves, but they get to see kind of white notions of self, and then also African American notions. And I know from looking at the data portraits, the book, it's that idea that so often, and it's still so true now, African Americans have to see themselves expressed through the eyes of white people talking about them. And in some ways, what's really cool about this is that even though they're seeing her performance piece really kind of plays with and addresses kind of, what it's like to see that kind of real kind of population, or sort of nation within a nation that Du Bois wants to make, and then these other representations of people who are portraying slaves or portraying deepest, darkest Africa. You guys totally should know each other. I feel like yeah, I mean, and I put the link for the musical in the chat, and then she's got a TED talk also about it.
Amazing.
So yeah, I'm hoping that your spheres intersect.
Me
And the
too.
other thing, I'll just steal my last little bit of time and then shut up, which is when I was reading about and I'm not, is it Theaster?
Theaster Gates.
That he and Du Bois really seem to me like they are, in some ways, like the thing that is the most cool and maybe the most powerful about them is that they are so much resistant about being just one thing. So they're not a sociologist, they're not an artist, they're not an activist. They're all those things mixed together. And I think especially in our culture, for whatever reason, that's just a very irresistible combination. It's like as soon as you break those boundaries down, it's the power dynamic is kind of disrupted a little bit. So I'm going to stop. I really enjoyed your talk,
amazing.
and I love this book so much.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for that reference. It's really amazing. I can really relate to both of them too, as like, that's where that polymodal quality comes from. Like, I'm very interested in all of this writing, data visualization, design, poetry, performance. So that really inspired me. Lisa Bayer has a question. Lisa, do you want to say your question, or do you want me to read your question for you?
Can you all hear me now? I really didn't want to read this question, but I will. Sorry. I'm director of the University of Georgia Press, by the way, Silas. And
cool.
Our art director is on this call, and she's trying to share somehow in the Q&A a cover of a book, a recent book, on which we used one of Du Bois's
excellent
images, which you've just discussed. My question is, if we could bring you to Georgia today, and you went to Atlanta University in Atlanta and worked with students on some sort of contemporary project around identity, etc., all the wonderful things you've just mentioned, what would it be? I'm just curious as to what you might say.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would love to meet with Stacey Abrams, and like to kind of look at like like what's happening with the shifting demographics of Georgia, and particularly around voting and expressing our civic duty. I think there's such a long history of exclusion and barriers for civic discourse and civic action. So I feel like that would be something that I would be really interested in looking at. I also just feel like Atlanta in particular is this bastion of like juicy blackness and black innovation and creativity and art, both in cinematic spaces but also in visual spaces and other forms. So I think similar to Du Bois and his students, we would have a lot of topics that we could really look at and investigate. And I also would love to see what the students, like what are the students interested in, which I think was really powerful about University of the Arts, was that each student brought their way of looking at what data was. And that included one amazing qualitative research informed essay about a kind of new take on double consciousness in the 21st century. And so I think the notion of what data is can take many forms. And to me, I'm really interested in that space of dialogue and collaboration that can happen when you do a workshop. The next thing in here is from Whitney Barr. It's not a question, but this presentation was so dope, and thank you for sharing your expertise. I've been inspired by Du Bois' work for my thesis work. That's awesome. I would love to know what your thesis is about and what you're working on. I don't know if do you want to speak to that, Whitney?
I'll just talk a little bit about it. So I'm in the landscape architecture department, and my thesis is focused on designing for racial healing, specifically within former plantation landscapes, trying to go back to perhaps the most violent landscape in America, especially for members of the African diaspora. And in doing that, trying to think through ways to share the data that is not re-traumatizing. And I think that sometimes because the way we are taught to design is through such a Eurocentric lens, it's really easy to just kind of tell the story like from a deficit perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's very challenging to try to communicate that, like to show the resilience. And that's what I'm trying to figure out, is how can we reimagine Black joy in these spaces? Very literally, and what kind of program items need to be there, what kind of props would actually make us feel seen, how do we hold on to intergenerational knowledge? And so with Du Bois's work, I have just been going back over so many of the infographics and trying to understand how he must have found the energy to share a perspective that was definitely not asked for at that time. And how do you do it in a way that doesn't leave you so drained at the end? And when I read the book, I don't feel, I don't feel left depleted. It was very encouraging to see the perspective from a Black person.
Wow. Whitney, thank you so much. And your thesis sounds incredible. And I just wish you the best and encourage you in that process. I can sort of share kind of my thoughts or my experience related to that, because I'm writing this course called Black Data, which is it's for the spring. It's about sort of looking at what you're talking about, both sort of the ways in which data visualization and graphics around data have oppressed and also made visible, particularly people of color and other disenfranchised or previously marginalized people. And I'm interested in both facing sort of the trauma and tragedy, like, for example, the Tuskegee study. But then also I think of, there's a group that's operating right now called Data for Black Lives. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that collective,
No,
but
I haven't.
yeah, check that out. They have a pretty amazing website, and also sort of chapters that they're building, so that there be local chapters of this organization that is basically about empowering communities of color to get access to the data that's about them. So it's a way to kind of empower communities and collective action, rather than sort of like those who are gathering the data, scientists or sociologists or corporations. It's about sort of breaking through those data sets, and putting them in the hands of the people that the data is about, so that collective has a really hopeful, optimistic story. And I need that to counterbalance the kind of heaviness or the weight that we're dealing with. So that personally, that's what I do to sort of sustain this. And then also just a lot of self-care too, like doing things that are like nice for you. Like surfing is a huge resource for me. So like I do my best to make time to do that. And then I can sort of come back to the fight and to working this out. The other thing that I would say, Whitney, is, and this has been the case with my own thesis, is that a thesis is really just a beginning point, even though it is a culmination of your study. It's been sort of basically 12 years, since my thesis, and that I feel like I finally know. And it was about this idea of being polymodal and the relationship of identity to design and expression. And I feel like I'm just starting to get a sense of like the full implications and full expression of that. Mm-hmm. So I would also just say it will unfold as you go.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Lacey Hamilton has a question. Oh, this is cool. Yeah, hey, Lacey.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Okay, I don't know how to turn my camera on. I don't mean to be antisocial.
No worries.
Hello. I'm a art history master's student. I'm actually currently doing research on these data visualizations, looking at them from an art historical perspective, which is a bit difficult because they so predate that kind of modular depiction that you're talking about. So I'm kind of looking at why maybe he chose to abstract this data based on Black lives and on the Black American experience at this time. From what I'm taught, from my background in art history, there's kind of a general way that you read abstraction, and that it's kind of, it takes you back to zero, you know what I'm saying? And it's kind of universal language. I'm wondering if when you read these data visualizations, do you think maybe that would be one of the reasons why he chose to depict the data in this way?
Yeah, I think so, particularly because so many depictions of figuration for Black folks was so characterized or violent or brutal. I think his sense, as someone who's coming from sociology, it made sense that it was like a way to communicate the data in a way that was clear and rational, and also perhaps not twinged with notions of the physical appearance of the body as a way to discriminate. And so I think that there is a intentional action on his part to do that. At the same time, in the exhibit, there were also all these photographs that represented, and I didn't really get into that, but all these photographs that represent sort of the best of, like, particularly bourgeoisie and Black education at the time, So you have that Hampton album. I don't know if you've seen that.
Yes, yeah. There's definitely been a lot more art historical research on the photography.
Yeah. So I'm actually really curious to see what you discover, because based on what I think his models were not in art, they were actually in like sociology and other forms of data visualization or research. That's hence Playfair and Nightingale. I mean, he was very cultured, so I imagine he was also looking at art, and based on the way that he commissioned graphic designers and artists for The Crisis, which came later, like folks like Aaron Douglas and other Black artists and illustrators, Louise E. Jefferson, I know he was thinking about visuality. And Britt and Whitney also in their essay referenced this speculative fiction that he was also writing. What is it called? He wrote a couple of them, but I think the one that they reference is called like the Steel Princess. I'm not sure, but he writes basically this like speculative fiction about a scientist in the future who's like using this scope, and which is kind of like a metaphor for the charts,
Right.
which is super interesting. So I know he's thinking and writing about this idea of like moving to abstraction, but he doesn't, based on what I've discovered, and I hope you find some reference. I don't know what he's directly looking at in terms of like maybe art to influence
I
these.
think my research currently, I'm trying not to explicitly say, oh, well, he was well adversed in art history, you know?
Right.
But there is, in the field of art history, there, I think most popularly data visualizations through chronophotography, like the famous like Muybridge horse galloping, and you can see that, you know, there's never a time when both of the feet aren't on the ground, that kind of thing. That's been used to discuss cubism. So I do think that there's a place in the field of art history to talk about, you know, these designs without explicitly saying, oh, you know, Mondrian saw this and that's why he made But thank you.
Yeah, that was a great question, and like such a great area of research. Like I can't wait to see once you complete that work what you find out.
Thank you so much. We'll see if it ever happens.
Right. That's why we don't have to be alone as researchers and thinkers. We really get to be in dialogue with each other.
That's nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This next question looks awesome from Moon. Jang, do you want to say your question, Moon?
Hello? Hello?
Hi.
Hi, Silas. Thank you so much for inspiring and amazing lecture. It's just genuinely inspired by all your work and the talk. Specifically, you know, the slides that you shifted from the isotype, the Otto and Mary Neurath, the isotype picture to the visualizing Black America. So I mean, it's a decolonizing and reframing the history of visual communication design has been like a buzzword in our field. By the way, I'm a graphic design teacher here at UGA.
Amazing.
and designer. So I was wondering, and I guess it requires the consistent and collective effort and motivation to reconfigure the history of visual communication design. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions for design educators and design students to make that happen on a daily basis. And,
totally.
and I had a second question actually regarding the Du Bois data portraits. I was wondering, because a lot of students were involved in this project, so I was wondering if there is any notes or records or a journal that explains what was the design process was like at the time. in the studio, or do they have any design constraints to make this visualization more effective and efficient? So yeah, those are the two questions I had.
Yeah, no, those are both are amazing questions. I'll answer the second one first. Basically, everything we know about the way the plates are made in any process comes from Du Bois's own writings and autobiography, and then things published either by, there was a pretty amazing publishing program from his department of sociology at Atlanta University. So there's a lot of records of reports, studies that were published by he and his students, as well as bulletins about the comings and goings of alumni and activities that they were doing. And that's how we found Rogers and that sort of correspondence is because it was being like published there. And so a lot of that material comes from the archive at Amherst. And then there also are there's an issue of the Colored American that also has sort of records of the exhibition and other sort of local publications around Buffalo and the Pan American Expo. So that's where we got a lot of that information. I think one of the things that I'm really curious about that I haven't had the chance to do, and other researchers might do this, is also, is there press or publication about the exhibit in Europe, which would be pretty interesting to sort of like connect that to that. And like when the award was made, was there some kind of analysis of the actual like materiality of the exhibition, or was it just kind of a general response to the exhibit? So I think there could be kind of further study, and maybe, I mean, I think Du Bois's papers are kind of the most extent of what's represented. I don't know if the Library of Congress has additional matter that kind of came with the exhibit, if there was any kind of documentation, but we have not found it yet. And then to answer your first question about decolonizing design history, which yes is a buzzword and also is a long time coming, I think it's really nice that there's so many resources now with folks who are doing that work. One thing that I want to invite you to, and maybe Mark can give you my contact because he told me about you sort of before this visit, is that I and Louise Sandhouse and a few other educators and historians have started this thing called Design History Fridays. We started it last summer, pre-COVID, like at my dining room table, where Louise was sort of struggling with doing research in design history and having a place to sort of discuss it. And so now we have like, they're totally free and multi-leveled from all these different institutions, from curators to design writers and people who are teaching design history the first time or who have been teaching it for 25 years. And so there's been a lot of really great presentations. And we also have an archive of recordings. So we just meet like in a Zoom and have discussions like once every 3 weeks during the academic year. So I'll send you an invitation to that. But I'm also just like want to spotlight like Ramon Tejada's Decolonizing Design Education. He has a Google Doc that's this open platform that he takes suggestions on. And then actually I'm working on a BIPOC-centered design history course that's like focused on Black design in America with a couple of colleagues, Tashika Arsenio Sutton and Peter Bowens. And so we're framing that as like a video course that's going to happen in January that actually would be available to educators and students. That would be a series of, I think we're looking at around 10 talks that would be pre-recorded. People could watch them. You could watch them standalone or watch them also set, and there'd be a sliding scale so that it's accessible to as many people as needed. And then would be paired with Q&As that are live after the video gets posted. So I'll share that like as it's coming. But I think it is the dialogue, being able to have that's the sort of support and know that like Moon, you don't have to do it alone. You know, like I don't have to do it alone. That we can sort of learn with and support each other in that process. Okay. Hi, Shauna.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How's it going?
Okay, great presentation.
Thank you.
I was interested in you know, when you talked about the tour, you know, that ensued, and you know, I was fascinated with the two images that that you had of, you know, how the displays looked in Paris, and also in one where was the other city? I'm sorry.
Buffalo.
In Buffalo. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, did you come across more images in other cities, or was that kind of it?
You know, I haven't been have not come across that yet. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but I do know there were a couple of other cities on that tour, and I think part of what Britt and Whitney and Alden and Mabel all were kind of grappling with was like, I feel like our book was just kind of scratching the surface potentially, right? Of this study and all of its implications. And Britt even wrote that kind of in the conclusion, sort of saying that like, hopefully this could lead to other studies and more research because of this nature of erasure that's happened to Du Bois's sociology because he was Black. And then also the materials themselves being, there's only one edition of them rather than being multiples, I think really impacted its documentation.
Yeah, because I was fascinated with, you know, the story of how, when you mentioned, you know, how much effort it took for him to even get to Paris, period, or for the, you know, for the designs to even get there, you know, and for so many weeks that took for it to travel. And so it kind of made me, you know, think about like even just the displays themselves, like,
yes,
you know, how they were, you know, kind of hampered by time and how they might have developed. You know, I could tell like with the Buffalo image that, you know, there had been some enhancements, you know, that they were probably able to introduce, but that just kind of interested me in terms of how the public understood you know, everything just by the way that the designs were presented to them.
Yeah, I feel like that was also part of the design's ingenuity is the modularity of it, you know, right? Because of steerage, because of the short timeline, that it was something that you could just pack into boxes, right? And then reconfigure and rearrange. And I think that I would love to like study more of that and sort of there's sort of the implications of like, did Du Bois sort of just redesign it, you know, for Buffalo? I imagine he did, but that I wonder if that was conceived of in the original plan, or if it was just because it had so much visibility in Europe, then the sort of Black cognoscenti of the United States were like, oh yes, we gotta. I could see TJ Calloway being kind of the catalyst also for like, we need to disseminate this, and Du Bois supporting that too, like across the United States when it returned.
Right.
So Brandon, you have some questions about performative aspects.
Yes, can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, hi Brandon.
So my question centers around the sort of the performative aspect of these world fairs and these shows, and I was asking specifically about Henry Box Brown created this huge traveling panorama called Mirror of Slavery, or maybe it's Mirrors of Slavery, I'm not sure if it's singular or plural, in 1850 that traveled to London, and it was this huge moving panorama with performers and narrators telling the story of slavery from an African village through Middle Passage to slavery, and then, and this is still in 1850, the envisioned future of universal emancipation. And it was a very successful way that European abolitionist societies started to build up real steam to really start funding American abolitionist efforts through the 1850s into the 1860s. And I was just wondering if there was any performative aspect to the Paris exhibition beyond just, you know, the interactive nature of the exhibition is performative in itself. But was there any kind of performance aspect that went along with it?
Yeah, I feel like that's such a great question. You're basically having me imagine, because Du Bois was physically there for a good chunk of the display. So I'm trying to imagine the sort of user experience of like what kinds of conversations were happening in that, you know, exhibit as people were, you know, turning over or investigating all of the elements there. I don't think it was sort of considered quite so theatrical as Henry Box Brown, but I think it's very clear that the design of the broadsheets and the posters was for display. It was designed to strike and catch your eye to come and enter the exhibit. And because there was so much information, I know it was also intentional for them to be variable, because there was literally the surface area of the exhibition could not fully support all of the diagrams that were made, not to mention all of the other artifacts. So I imagine there was probably some kind of docent, but this would be really cool to find out more specifically, like, is there evidence of that? And I think that's kind of it's that European documentation or representation that I think will take more sort of combing or searching through archives. To think part of why a lot of our information is centered around the sort of American perspective or Du Boisian perspectives, because his archive was so meticulous. And so like everything that we know comes from his papers or things that are at Atlanta University. And so I think it'll just take, especially in a COVID situation, you know, a little bit more time, or maybe even like kind of like traveling to sort of see, are there records or documentation of how it was received in Europe, and particularly in Paris during the exhibition. So I don't know if anyone has leads on like where documentation of things around a World's Fair go after they are taken down, or if it's kind of more kind of like each exhibit, you know, kind of goes its separate ways. But that's now I want to try to answer your question, Brandon, which is always great. When I share about this, I always find more questions and more things that need consideration.
Thank you so much.
Guthrie.
Hi, yeah. So I don't know if we can look at the plates right now.
Sure.
But my question was about plate 17, but also just about all of them in general. Just as an example, that one, it's the one with a double, as you wrote, double curved outlier at the end of a series of straight bars, which he used to represent course enrollment by subject, and particularly to like emphasize that it was all in like industry, and very little in any other subjects. And it just strikes me throughout the whole book and all of the plates that these aren't structures of data visualization that are easily replicable in Excel or Tableau or any kind of data visualization software. Not necessarily that like my only reaction from this book is like, how can I appropriate this? But it's, I mean, it feels like he made this amazing thing, and a lot of it, except for the Mondrian thing, plate 57 looks, I mean, he invented the like Mondrian. But other than that, a lot of, I'm wondering if, do you know of any efforts to like use these plates as templates for visualization? Either automatically or manually?
Yeah, I know that there's, I just met him the last time I was talking about, there's a contemporary Black graphic designer and data visualization expert who has digitized them. Like he made vector versions of the charts. It's not been used like for other data sets. I think maybe what the students at University Arts did is like maybe the closest to that. But I'm spacing on this person's name, but it's cool. You can actually order versions of his digitized prints, so you can like have a vector version of plate 7. Like if you like plate 17, you can order a copy of that, which to me I think is really interesting. Is that what you're sort of talking about them as like the portability of a graphic form, which is super interesting. And like I could even see like what would a Sheets or Excel or Google Sheets version of like diagram templates in a Du Boisian style, which seems really interesting, or some kind of plugin, or I don't know, something you script in P5 would be really interesting to see about it being a tool for today.
Great. Well, thank you, Silas. Thank you for sharing this time with us. And seeing these wonderful expressions of gratitude come in from our audience. And I want to thank the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts once again for supporting this. And we look forward to future meetings and workshops. And this has really piqued the interest, I think, for a lot of folks here. So grateful to you. Thank you, Silas.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy more of the Spotlight on the Arts Festival.